If you go to Rome, you'll see a magnificent basilica dedicated to St. Peter. You'll marvel at masterpieces like the Pietà. You'll tour the tomb where legend says he's buried. Few will realize the treasure hidden beneath their feet, because the floor where Peter rests is also the floor of the world's smallest country. That's right, this tiny patch of land inside Rome is an independent nation. It has its own government, its own laws, its own currency, and for centuries it's grown richer than almost any other nation on earth. Welcome to the Vatican City. Every year, millions of pilgrims walk through these gates. They come to pray, to witness history, to experience faith. Many see the famous dome designed by Bramante, Michelangelo, and completed by the brilliant mind of Bernini. They see the place where popes are elected, where priests are ordained, where history unfolds. But most don't see what lies behind the scenes. They don't see the global fortune created over 2,000 years, the secrets hidden in plain sight, the true source of the Vatican's power. The first chapter began when St. Peter arrived in ancient Rome, according to tradition. He was crucified upside down in the 60s AD, right around here, and soon, his tomb became a place of pilgrimage. People traveled from miles around to pay their respects to the rock on which the church would be built. And there it stood for centuries, a small chapel made of stone. Then, in the 1100s, construction started on a grander structure, a basilica, to replace the simple chapel. Construction took decades, popes died and new ones took their place. But slowly a masterpiece emerged, the first St. Peter's Basilica. It was larger than any church in Christendom. But while the faithful flocked to worship inside, another kind of wealth was growing outside. The church was accumulating land. At first, it was donations, usually small plots given by grateful worshippers. Then came the tithes, a tenth of every Christian's income. Before long, the church wasn't just a spiritual leader, it was a landowner. In fact, it was becoming the largest landowner in Europe. As the power of the papacy grew, so did the size of its estate. Kings and queens gifted land for recognition, forgiveness, or as payment for a pope's support. Over time, the church's land grew exponentially. By the 1300s, the popes were living like royalty. They moved out of the humble Lateran palace and into this, the apostolic palace, filled with art, gold, and unimaginable luxury. But then everything changed. In 1527, soldiers of the Holy Roman Empire sacked Rome. They ransacked churches, palaces, and monuments. It was the worst attack in the city's history, and when the dust settled, the church was left in ruins. But amidst the chaos, the papacy seized an opportunity. They kicked out the invaders and claimed all the land they had seized as reward. Overnight, the Catholic Church gained vast estates across central Italy, and that was just the beginning. Over the next few centuries, the church continued acquiring land. They received entire villages from grateful Italian states. They purchased vast forests and farmlands throughout southern Italy. They took control of several major Italian banks. And before long, the church owned enormous vineyards, factories, apartment buildings, palaces, artworks, and the list goes on. In fact, by the late 1800s, the Catholic Church was arguably the largest landowner in the entire world. And yet, despite all this, it was not satisfied. Just a few decades later, the papacy would acquire its most valuable asset. But for now, let's return to the early 1900s. After centuries of steady growth, the church found itself in turmoil. Italy had unified and Rome was no longer a separate state. There were calls for reform. Catholics were being elected to public office, and the church needed a way to stay relevant. The answer came in 1929. Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, wanted to restore the papacy's power. He negotiated a deal with the Pope, establishing the Vatican as an independent state. It was only 110 acres, but it was sovereign. Since then, the Vatican has remained one of the world's smallest countries. It has one of the smallest populations, all of 1,000 residents. It produces virtually nothing. It doesn't need to, thanks to centuries of expansion. It owns so much property around the world that it never has to sell. Most of its income comes from a handful of sources. One is donations from Catholics around the world. Another is the sales of souvenirs, stamps, and coins. Yet another is renting out its massive real estate portfolio. And finally, there are the investments. Holdings in some of Europe's biggest banks, including the troubled Banco Ambrosiano. In the 1980s, this bank would become the center of a major scandal. Billions of dollars vanished and a bishop was found murdered. Despite the controversy, the church hung on to its investments, both good and bad. And today, it manages tens of billions of dollars in assets. The reason for this success is simple. For almost 2,000 years, the Catholic Church has been the largest non-governmental organization in the world. It's collected donations, built businesses, seized opportunities. It's lived through wars, plagues, and revolutions. And all the while it kept track of its assets. Today, it owns the world's largest collection of Renaissance art. It has an apartment building in Manhattan worth hundreds of millions. It owns vineyards, castles, and countless historical landmarks. And yet, despite this staggering wealth, there is something it doesn't have. It has never invested in technology. For example, in the early days of computing, The church dismissed punch cards and vacuum tubes as tools of the devil. When radio was invented, it worried about the corrupting influence of mass media. When the internet arrived, it feared the spread of heresy. These fears proved misplaced. Today, other institutions own far more tech, but the church's attitude reveals a deeper truth. For most of history, it never needed to invest. It could afford to ignore innovations because it had something else: time. While kings rose and fell, while nations fought and traded, the church endured. It kept collecting tithes, welcoming converts, and holding on to its assets. Slowly, steadily, it amassed a fortune, generation after generation, millennium after millennium. Now, consider the second half of the 20th century. New challenges emerged. Wars were fought in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. Conflicts drained national budgets, but not the church's coffers. When economies crashed, when stocks plummeted and banks collapsed, the church held on tight to its investments. But not all weathered the storm. Banco Ambrosiano was one such casualty. As mentioned earlier, billions went missing in the 1980s. A bishop was strangled in a London parking garage, but the church didn't withdraw. It pressed on, restructuring, adapting, and surviving. By the turn of the 21st century, it once again owned more real estate in central London than any other private owner. Yet for all its wealth, the church faced a new threat: secularization. As Europeans abandoned religion, they cut funding to the church. Today, most European countries spend less than 1% of their budgets on religion, and this trend isn't limited to Europe. In the United States, church attendance has dropped from over 40% in the 1950s to less than 30% today. With fewer parishioners, the church's income has stagnated. If anything, it's slightly declined. In other words, the system that has endured for 2 millennia may be nearing its end. Fewer people are tithing, fewer people are donating, and fewer people are joining the church, but not all is lost. The church still owns billions of dollars in property. It still receives money from more than 1 billion Catholics around the world, and it still manages a diverse portfolio of investments. The key question is, what will it do next? Will it continue buying buildings in central London? Will it seek new investments in Latin America? Or will it focus on preserving its existing assets? Only time will tell. But now it's time for you to tell me what you think. Do you think the Vatican should reveal its full wealth? How would that change the world? How powerful would the church really be? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching.